Shabbat Shalom. So we can put on the screen some slides that will help us learn more about the day that has just come to a close. Jewish time, days begin and end at sundown. And so today is now officially, the sun having set, the 11th of the Hebrew month of Tevet. But the day that was the 10th of Tevet, or in Hebrew, Asara b'Tevet. How many of us observed Asara b'Tevet today? Yeah, your rabbi did not observe Asara b'Tevet. Asara b'Tevet is one of several minor fast days in the Jewish tradition. So if you ate anything today, you've already violated Asara b'Tevet. The question is, what is this minor fast day? What's it all about? Why fast at all? Don't we have enough fasting on Yom Kippur? And if you're familiar, on Tisha B'Av in the summer, which is the holiday or the observance that commemorates the destruction of the temple. Now, I've put an image up on the screen. Does anyone recognize the kind of engraved relief where you might find that in the world? It's a real landmark. Yes, in Rome. Right, okay. Anyone want to get more specific? Which landmark? Is this the Colosseum? It's not the Colosseum. All right, so what is this landmark in Rome? It is part of the... No, it is not part of the Senate, though it is part of the Arch of Titus, a big victory arch that was erected in commemoration of the emperor who finally destroyed the Jewish kingdom of Judea in the year 70 of the Common Era. And you can see here that there are Jewish slaves who are being carted off in chains along with treasures from the ancient temple in Jerusalem, including the 7-branched candelabra or menorah. So we know already that I've teed up a visual that something about this day has to do with the destruction of the temple. But I told you moments ago that the main observance of the destruction of the temple is in like July or August. It's in the month of Av. Tisha B'Av means the 9th of the month of Av. So usually when kids are off at camp and folks around here are traveling and are in the Hamptons, we're here sitting in sackcloth and ashes and fasting for a full 25 hours, just like Yom Kippur. And wouldn't that be enough to commemorate the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem? You would think, but it is not. There is more than one fast day associated with the destruction. So let us learn. From Pninei Halacha, which is a digest of Jewish law, actually written by a living rabbi who's the head of a yeshiva in Israel, Eliezer Melamed. You can see he's in his 60s. He has this to say, which summarizes the meaning of the day that was, the 10th of the month of Tevet. The prophets established a fast day on the 10th of Tevet because that is when Nebuchadnezzar, specifically the Emperor Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylonia, king of Babylonia, and his army arrived to besiege Jerusalem, marking the beginning of the series of catastrophes that culminated in the destruction of the first temple and the exile of the Shekhinah. So a little Jewish theology here. The Shekhinah is that aspect of God's presence which can actually be felt here on earth. It's a Kabbalistic idea, an idea from Jewish mysticism, that God in God's totality can never be perceived by a human being. God is too awesome, too magnificent, too beyond for our mere mortal minds to comprehend. But we can sense God's presence here on earth. And that presence, that indwelling nature of God here in the realm of human affairs, of earthly affairs, is known as Shekhinah, which literally means that which dwells. It is also in Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism, associated with the feminine aspect of God. So for the Kabbalistic rabbis of the Middle Ages, God's masculine presence is transcendent, all-powerful, omnipotent. God's feminine aspect is loving, compassionate. My microphone is falling off my belt loop. Loving, compassionate, and dwells here on earth, is intimate. So God can be both close and loving and near, and far and mighty and transcendent at the same time. That's one of the Kabbalistic paradoxes that they assign to God. Continuing, although the siege that led to the destruction of the Second Temple began on a different date, the beginning of the overall destruction of the temple and the Jewish kingdom occurred on the 10th of Tevet. So they're saying it wasn't the final blow that destroyed the temple and caused the destruction of the Jewish kingdom, but it was the beginning of the end. And so for 30 months, between January or winter of 588 BCE, which is how Jewish people talk about time before Jesus walked the earth, before the Common Era or before the Christian era, until 30 months later in the summer of 586 BCE, the Babylonians were laying siege to the first temple in Jerusalem. All right, so that's why we have a separate observance. Tisha B'Av is about the destruction of the second temple and the first. This holiday is primarily about the first temple, when the Babylonians took over. It continues, once Asara B'Tevet was established as a fast day, the sages added two other painful events. So they said, you know what? That's not the only bad thing that happened to the Jewish people on this day. So they look at the calendar and say, aha, on this date in Jewish history, the 10th of Tevet, we also mark the death of Ezra the scribe, which occurred on the 9th of Tevet, so a day before, and the translation of the Torah into Greek, which occurred on the 8th of Tevet. So the rabbis believe this was a very, very bad week for the Jewish people. 3 days in a row, something bad happened. I'm going to get ahead of you and say, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wait a minute, I can get the beginning of a 30-month siege of Jerusalem as a bad thing for the Jewish people. And I can get the death of Ezra the scribe, who was the first to have written down the Torah and to have instituted the custom of reading Torah in public. His death was a bad thing for the Jewish people. But why translating the Torah into Greek? Why is that so bad? Anyone want to venture a guess why, in the mind of the ancient rabbis, translating the Torah into Greek was a bad thing and not a good thing? Right. It was brought about. What Mike just shared with us is that it was going away or falling away from the tradition. The reason the Torah was translated into Greek in the first place is because Jews weren't able to speak Hebrew anymore. It was no longer a Jewish vernacular. And so the literature itself, the Torah tradition, the heart of the Jewish tradition, was becoming more and more removed from Jewish understanding and practice. So translating it into Greek, while it made it accessible for the masses, so this rabbi thinks, well, maybe not such a bad thing. Translating the Torah so that more people could understand it, good. But the fact that it had to be translated in the first place because no one could understand it in Hebrew, bad. Anyway, really bad week for the Jewish people. So the rabbis just bundled all of it together and said, let's proclaim a fast. Continuing, the chief rabbinate of Israel, meaning in the modern state of Israel in the 20th century, further established this day for general mourning and for the recitation of Kaddish, for the martyrs who were killed in the Holocaust and whose date of death is unknown. So the rabbis in the modern era, now jumping way forward in time to the 20th century, said, you know what? The state of Israel was, of course, established in 1948. It is very much the product of the trauma of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and there are countless numbers of Jews whose graves are unmarked, whose names are unknown, and the rabbi said, we need a day on the Jewish calendar for saying Kaddish for all of these Jews. And interestingly, the rabbis were, in the early statehood period of Israel, were really reluctant to put more occasions for mourning onto the 9th of Av. They didn't want to turn Tisha B'Av, the main holiday for commemorating the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, into another Holocaust observance. And so they said, we'll just make sure that you can say Kaddish for the nameless martyrs of the Shoah on some day of the year. And they said, we've already got a few other lousy days. How about the 10th of Tevet, Asara B'Tevet? We're already fasting. We're already in a kind of depressed state. Perfect timing. Maimonides, I'm really taking us through a time machine tonight. We're now going to go back from the 20th century all the way to the 13th. So jump 800 years backward in time. Maimonides was the greatest explicator of Jewish practice and law. He had this to say: there are certain fast days that the entire Jewish people observe on account of the suffering that happened on those dates. He wants to articulate specifically why fast. Like, we know that bad things happen, but what does fasting do for us? It is to acknowledge the suffering that happened on those dates. Their aim is to stir our hearts to be open to teshuvah, or repentance, and to remind us both of the wicked deeds of our ancestors and our own actions which have caused anguish to befall both them and us. This isn't just history, this is our story. Or as my teacher, Rabbi Larry Kushner, likes to say, the Torah is true not because it happened, but because it happens. In other words, we see ourselves and our story in the text that we study. They are not only things that happened to those people long ago, but rather part of our embedded narrative and therefore central to our identity as Jews. Continues, they remind us of these things to cause us to return to the good. As it is said, and they shall confess their transgressions and the transgressions of their ancestors, which is at the very end of the book of Leviticus, which is part of the way in which the Torah says, this is how you return to God after transgression. It begins with confession and acknowledgement that to some extent we brought this suffering upon ourselves. There's a lot theologically that I don't agree with here, but I'm asking you to bear with me for a few questions for reflection. First, my remarks were already prepared before the fires broke out this week. And I realized that we have an occasion to mention the fires here as well. Because throughout Jewish history, in times of disaster, whether man-made or natural, and in the case of the fires in LA, I would say they are both natural. They are wildfires, but they are also being caused, at least in part, by rapid climate change. In times of disaster in many Jewish communities throughout history, it was customary to declare a fast in response to a community crisis. This was well attested. I was going back through some medieval letters that communities were exchanging with each other, one of which said, my entire house burned down because somebody fired a gun. This was in, I think, the 1600s. Somebody fired a gun, and the gunpowder sparked and burned my entire house and garden down. And fortunately, we were spared, and so the rabbi of our community declared a fast day for the entire community. This was very common throughout Jewish history. So not only do you have calendrical fasts, fasts that are fixed on the Jewish calendar, like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, like Tisha B'Av, the day of the destruction of the temple by the Romans, like the 10th of Tevet, the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem, and there are still others, by the way. There's a fast associated with Esther that is held shortly before the Purim holiday. There's another fast pertaining to the destruction of the temple 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av. There's a fast about a king named Gedaliah who died. It almost always falls on my birthday, right before Rosh Hashanah. So there are all sorts of, right around Rosh Hashanah, there are all of these fast days on the Jewish calendar. And so it made me want to ask the congregation tonight a few questions for reflection. And I'd love to just present these to you, and then if anyone has a response to any of them, you may chime in. First, the Reform movement has, by and large, disregarded the Jewish calendar's minor fast days. Yes, I have had 2 square meals so far today, and Kelly's cooking a third. So I was violating the fast of Asara b'Tevet from 8 a.m. Does the practice of fasting multiple times a year deserve to be reconsidered? I'm going to assume that many of us have or do fast on Yom Kippur, but typically don't or even haven't fasted on any other calendar days of the year? That's the first question. Is there anything worth reconsidering about this? Reform movement, by the way, reconsiders Jewish practices all the time. 2 generations ago, Reformed Jews wouldn't be caught dead wearing one of these or one of these. Now it's fairly commonplace in synagogues for Jewish people, even in Reformed settings, to wear traditional garb. So maybe fast days. Next. What value is there to be found today in recalling the events that are traditionally assigned as fast days? Even without the ritual of fasting, is there value for our community in recalling these moments of tragedy? And finally, does the calamity of October 7th, 2023, and then I added parenthetically just yesterday, or the wildfires in LA, for instance, influence your thinking on these questions? Are we living in a particular moment or era in Jewish time that prompts us to rethink how our observances allow us to interact Jewishly with the world around us. All right, you can chime in on any of this. Let's start with Michelle. You've got a hand up. Thank you. Okay, so you've kind of like flipped this on its head. You've said, one, fasting is not actually necessarily only about deprivation. Actually, maybe we are endangering our health not from too little, but too much. Maybe there are more people whose health is compromised by the opposite of fasting. Maybe you could cut back a little bit. Also, maybe the fast is not there to invite us to wallow in tragedy, but rather to remind us of Jewish resilience. Despite all of these things that have happened to us, we are still here. Lovely. Very rabbinic way of thinking about the questions, by the way. Other reflections from you that these questions may prompt? Yeah, Jim. So Jim says that the remembrance of history is what is valuable here. We know the saying, one who does not remember history is doomed to repeat it. And I would add that fasting embeds remembrance, right? When you actually participate in an act that is a full body experience, the lesson may actually embed itself at a much deeper level, that we make a kind of Pavlovian association, so that we're not just talking about our suffering, we're actually participating in something that you can't help but be aware of, like every minute of the day. I will tell you, if you ever want to figure out a way to fast successfully, like to fast without discomfort, to fast without thinking about, oh my gosh, my stomach, what happened to my coffee this morning, how am I going to make it to the break fast? This works on Yom Kippur. It's very, very easy. Just become a rabbi. Just get a job where you have to work all day on Yom Kippur and think so carefully about every single thing you're doing that you don't have time to think about your tummy. Becoming a rabbi was the best thing I ever did for fasting. I do fast on Yom Kippur, and it just makes it so easy because there's like no time for my brain to worry about my stomach. If you're just sitting here, I don't know about you, but when I was a Jewish person before I became a rabbi, I found sitting at services on Yom Kippur occasionally boring. It was occasionally less than effervescent. So yeah, I would recommend that if you ever want to try and get through a Yom Kippur fast, just become a rabbi or a cantor. Cantors work even harder on Yom Kippur, right? Okay. Yes, Fran.
So it kind of connects to what Jim said, but it makes it very personal. You personally connect with the pain and suffering and the resilience of our ancestors both at the same time.
Thank you.
Doing what they had to do.
Right. Thank you. I mean, there's so much more we could say. I'm not just here. Fortunately, as Reformed Jews, the essence of our way through our tradition is known as autonomous informed choice. In other words, you, as the Jew in the pew, or the person who is associated through a Jewish family or community, you are the ultimate authority, not the rabbi, much less a central rabbi or seminary or institute. You, the people, we decide. But it has to be informed choice. Like you have to know what you're choosing or choosing not to participate in. I find that fasting is not the kind of thing I'm probably going to take up multiple times a year. It's just, I really like food, like a lot. Like I'm a total foodie and I really get hangry. You know what that is? It's like you're beyond hungry into anger. So when I'm not having to be the rabbi from dawn till dusk, like on Yom Kippur, I'm not the best at fasting. But every time I am fasting, I find that the practice is meaningful. I find that there are ways in which the fast reminds me, when I emerge from the fast, to be extra grateful for that bite of food. Because even a day of deprivation reminds us how blessed we are, not to worry about hunger the way billions of God's children are worrying about hunger tonight. Secondly, I think it does connect us in an intimate and personal way to other times and places and people in our tradition who have experienced great suffering. So there is a link between fasting and empathy. I also think there's a link between fasting and the recognition that we are all connected, right? You just take away that stuff that sustains your life for just a few hours and you feel pain. You recognize that you are not just an independent being totally disconnected from the universe, but you depend on farmers and grocery store workers and people who prepare and serve your meals. And if you deprive yourself of that even for a few hours, you come into a very rapid and deep recognition that you are not able to be alone in this world. And I think especially now, whether it's wildfires in LA or our Israeli brothers and sisters who are still grappling with the trauma of war, anything we can do to recognize that we're not alone in this very scary and difficult world might be a spiritually good practice for us. And finally, I would say that while it is not, in my view, the best Jewish practice constantly to be, again, I use the phrase wallowing in suffering, there is something to be said for the fact that we may not be fully cognizant of how much our people have endured in order for us to have the privilege of sitting here in the sanctuary tonight with bellies reasonably full and returning home after services to share a meal with our loved ones, or just with ourselves. Like, that is a privilege that we have not always enjoyed. When you think about the real effect of 30 months of siege works by a massive empire against the small kingdom of Judea, maybe you couldn't have visualized what war looks like before October 7th, 2023, and now we all can. So for all of these reasons, whether or not you actually indulge in the practice, I hope the next time one of these little dates rolls by on the Jewish calendar, it won't go by unnoticed. And with that, we will wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.